Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris for this acrylic painting tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you how to easily paint these country daisies in a rustic water can on a beautiful doily. So whether you are a beginner or painting for fun, this is simple, easy, and impressive. So let's get started. I used DecoArt Americana acrylic paint, my favorite brushes, and created the doily magic with a stencil from CD Stencil. If you would like a pattern with traceable step-by-step instructions, click the link below. The surface is MDF and I am sealing it with a coat of multi-purpose sealer using an 1.5" flat wash, which is super soft bristles, covers quickly, does not leave brush marks. I gave it a good quick dry and then lightly sanded it. Using my oval wash to slip slap bleach sand onto the bottom third of the plaque, and I'm blending it out towards the top just a little bit and towards the bottom. I don't have any hard straight lines. Applying a piece of tape using my T ruler to make sure that it is exactly straight. Going back now with warm white to brighten it up. This is the doily area. So I want it, I didn't want it solid white, but I wanted to have a gradation of colors with the center area being a little bit brighter and a little bit more ombre. And just taking some Snow White to brighten that top middle area up a little bit more. Position the doily and anchoring it down with a piece of painter's tape. Loading my spectacular stencil brush with Thicket. I load it into the bristles well and then wipe it across the paper towel, and that will eliminate any paint running under the edges of the stencil. That helps ensure that you will receive you're going to get a really crisp line when the stencil is removed. And I am also, when I go past the edge of the stencil, I'm blending it out so that it isn't a solid line either. It just makes it easier to bring those two areas together. Now I know I want that area behind the stencil to be a lot darker, so I picked up charcoal gray on the stencil brush, blended it in, and then darkened that area. I want to make sure to keep a light touch, and this is going a little bit faster so you can't really see, but I'm using a very soft, almost a circular application of the paint so that I don't press that paint underneath the stencil. Always, after reloading, wipe the stencil brush over a paper towel to remove the excess paint. My stencil brush, I worked a long time to get the stencil brush created. The bristles are very soft. Not only do you get like an airbrush up back, but it's very nice for blending paints together without receiving any brush marks or harsh lines. I did pick up a little bit of Thicket just to blend those two areas together, so I didn't have, it helps to soften that lighter background. And then I'm just going back with my stencil brush just to soften those areas because the bristles are so very soft. It's easy to work that paint together to get a really nice gradation from the dark behind the stencil to a lighter area towards the bottom of the plaque. Always best to apply several light layers as opposed to one heavy. Look how perfect that is. I know it looks kind of flat now, but once we work our magic, that's going to look fantastic. Now, another reason that I brought the paint up behind the stencil before I put the stencil on, if you put heavy paint up against the edge of the tape, you're going to get a ridge, and that just helps eliminate that ridge of paint. Using charcoal gray on the toe of my 1/2" awesome angle to float a darker shade below that doily. It's just going to help lift it off of the background, creates a little more dimension. Not using a smooth float. I call it my choppy float. I like the way that looks. It's not solid and heavy. I think it provides more movement, and it just looks a little bit looser. It's a lot less difficult to achieve, and you just get a more painterly effect. Just going to go back and touch up here and there. Just kind of tap and pull. And this is how I'm going to create that look of the folded doily. Just kind of bring that up. It's a double back-to-back float. Float just a little bit of that charcoal gray up one side and down the other. And then where it hits the bottom of the doily, I just put a little, almost like a little V there, and it just looks like that doily is folded over. It's basically an optical illusion. See how I notched that in? It just makes it look like there's a fold there. Just a simple way to create that look of dimension. Now you want to make sure when you put these folds in, you're not adding them evenly spaced. It always looks better if it's a little bit more random. This is the first time I used this particular stencil, and I wasn't sure if I was going to like the way it looked. So this whole project was kind of a new adventure for me. I did bring that fold over a little bit. It landed right where that big dark area is on the doily, and it was kind of hard to define that since it was dark anyway. So I just kind of moved that fold over just a little bit. I always think that uneven numbers, so I did the 3 folds. I wanted to put something on the bottom of the lace. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I wanted to bring down almost like it had a crocheted point on it, and playing around with it several different ways. I've decided that it was easiest to, and I'm just using my stylus and warm white to add the dip dots, but I thought it was easier once I figured out what I was going to do to add the dots all around the bottom, and then just bring those little points down. I kind of wanted the points to hang down and not go straight out. I thought that might look a little bit more natural. Each one of those dots is, they're not exact same size. I like the way that they're not all perfectly sized. I think that looks a little more natural and interesting. It does take a good bit of time to put these dip dots on. So if you're to that point, just put on some pretty music and have fun with it. This is where I decided it might be easier to, now that I know what I'm doing, to go ahead and put those dots around the edge. Decide where you want that point at, and then just go down from there. And they're not all identical. I think the way that the doily is hanging, having it a little bit irregular is more interesting than having it perfect. And be sure to pull some across the top edge as well. I thought that where that tabletop is, it definitely needs to be across. So I changed my mind on this and decided to make it go straight across instead of hanging down on that last one. Not a problem. I'll just take a little bit of that charcoal gray, touch that up, and it will totally disappear. That's one thing I love about acrylic paints. There's nothing that can't be fixed. Just tap it in there. And as I was looking at this doily, I thought it still was, it had a lot of design in it, and trying to figure out how to soften it up and make it look just a little bit more frilly. It's hard because there's so many open spaces on it to soften it down. So I'm taking just a little bit of that charcoal gray and I'm using it to separate where those folds or where those sections kind of crisscross over each other. And this is just kind of fun because you can create the look of the crochet by the way that you put those shades on there. Now I'm going in with a little bit of Snow White just to brighten some areas where it looks like it should be a little more of a ridge or a highlight on that doily. A little bit of paint makes a big difference, and I know I say that often, but it is so true. You can really change the illusion of how things appear by the simple application of just a touch of paint. Too much makes it kind of all the same, and then you lose that impact. So add a few touches, leave it alone, and then go back and add more if it's needed. At first, I thought I would just connect these sections with a simple line of decorative dots, and I think that could have worked, but I wasn't real crazy about the look that I was getting from that. And I left it in here because I think it's important to see the process of creating. And if something doesn't look right, just play around with it until you're happy with it. So at this point, I'm thinking, okay, do I need to add more? And in my mind, I always think, well, what's the worst that could happen? I just take it off and go, redo it. But the more that I added the dots, the more I could see that it was really starting to soften the whole effect down. I didn't want the doily to be so busy and such a strong design that it took away from the daisies. So I just continued on with the dip dots and filled all of those in until I liked the way it looked. Make sure once all the dots are filled in that you do give it a really thorough dry, and I use my heat tool for that. It's so easy to go back and kind of smudge those dip dots. I am going back now, just reinforcing those shadow areas so that the dots aren't bright in the valleys of those folds. Just using a little more of that charcoal gray, such a beautiful color to shade with. Make sure that you don't put it on too heavy. It's a very strong color, so that you need to be very light-handed when using this, but what a beautiful shadow color this is. Just a hint of color. What a little bit of color makes a big difference, and I will repeat that over. Going back now just to kind of soften that doily down so it's not such a strong color. But look at that. Now, you can't look at that and think it was a flat white doily. Look at what a difference all of that shading and the dip dots have made on that. Absolutely stunning. And how easy is that? It really doesn't take much, just a little bit of color here and there. I decided I wanted to add a little more design along that bottom edge. Loaded my Epic script liner, that's my 18-aught script liner, with a little bit of thin charcoal gray, just putting some, I guess you could call them vertical stitch lines. And just playing around with the doily, enhancing those areas with that charcoal gray just to separate them out a little bit more. And again, a little bit of paint, what a huge difference, because now all of those areas have become defined sections, and it almost looks like each one has been painted on individually. Little touches, that's all it takes sometimes. And it's not hard, it just takes a little bit of time. And again, it's just such a hint of color on my Epic script liner that once it dries, it's just very soft, not noticeable, but the overall impact is absolutely huge. Going back up into the top area, and I'm using Laurel. It's a newer color. Laurel and Thicket, and they're both just shades of that beautiful. That's the Thicket is a little bit darker, Laurel is a little bit lighter. Very loosely, and I have moisture in my oval wash, just loosely putting that background in. I want to make sure that doily is super, super dry, so I just added that at the top. Repositioning that painter's tape on the doily so that I can bring that paint down to that tabletop area. And you'll notice when I go to that edge of the tape that I either scoot along it or pull away from it. I never bring paint down to the tape because it will build a layer there. And I want to make sure that I don't have a ridge. I did pick up a touch of bleached sand just to lighten that a tad. I know that area in the background needs to have a lot of movement in it. I didn't go cover the middle up completely. I know that's where my watering can's going to be. Didn't feel like it was necessary to put paint in that area. I always put my paint on very loosely with a lot of moisture, very quickly, blend it together, and I usually add layers of color. I like the way it looks when one color is built over top of another one. If you're using translucent floats, that really starts to work together well. That looks like a strong color. I popped some bleached sand in there, but look how I blend it out. And because my paint is very loose and very wet, it's easy to work those colors together. I don't want it to be blended smoothly and perfectly. I love the way those brush strokes create movement. Before I go any further, I'm going to give this a good dry, see how it looks, see if I need more color added or whether that looks good as it is. I want to add design on this, and I love this postscript stencil. This is a collage stencil from CD Stencils. They have a beautiful selection of stencils. I like this one because it is so versatile. There's so many different designs on this one little stencil that you can use it over and over, and it looks totally different every time. I've loaded my spectacular stencil brush with charcoal gray, and I'm just dry brushing it very, very softly. I did peek at it. I just did a little bit and looked at it. That charcoal gray was a little bit too strong, so I picked up just a touch of Thicket. And what that does, it's going to tone that gray down, just make it a little bit softer. Every time I load my stencil brush, I wipe it onto the paper towel to remove the excess paint. I just want a hint of color. I don't want it to be solid and heavy. And you can see that I just moved the stencil down. I want to add that script on there. I would recommend that you use painter's tape to anchor it down because it will scooch around. Trying to decide what part of the stencil. I like it to be not the same. I like the randomness of this stencil. But you have to remember, if you flip it over, I just flipped it over, that the script is going to be backwards. So if you want to use the script, you have to flip it to the correct side. And I did turn my stencil over one way and then flip it back. I'm not worried about wet paint getting on the background because I use such a little bit of paint that it's not, it dries that quickly. Before you lift it completely, make sure that you have the design you want. If it's too strong, you can lightly sand it down. But if you're using your stencil and kind of moving it around, if you lift it completely off, sometimes it's hard to relocate it exactly where you want it to be. I love to add texture in the background, and I'm using my palette knife to add a little bit of a distressed effect. I have such a small amount of paint on my palette knife that it creates this, it almost looks like stucco or plaster. Have a very thin puddle of paint on my palette. I drag the flat of the knife through it, and there's just a very hint of paint on the back of the palette knife. You get these absolutely gorgeous distress effect on the surface. It's just absolutely amazing what it looks like. Now that I have everything on there and I really like it, I put a layer of ultra matte varnish on there to lock it in and make sure that my beautiful background is not going to be messed up. If I have a mistake and I need to redo something, it's going to lock it in place. I took a little bit of lush green and used my oval wash to slip slap in the background behind the watering can and the daisies. I just want to use that as a filler. I am using a 3/4 inch angle to base coat the watering can. I like a bigger brush. It seems to cover the areas more quickly. I try to keep all my strokes in the direction of whatever it is that I'm painting. So I'm keeping my strokes long and fluid. This is bleach sand, following the contour of the watering can. And to do the spout, blend it in well. To do the spout, I'm just going to drop down to a smaller 1/2 inch angle. I like to use angles to base coat with. I feel there's a big advantage to having the point. See how I can easily get into those angles on that spout very, very easily. I'm just going to put on one layer, give it a good dry, and then put on the next layers using a number 10 flat to do the handle. Start at one end and then just bring it around from the other side. I find that's easier for me to get a nice long fluid stroke. This is just the first coat, so with each added layer, it's going to become a little more solid. I'm not particularly concerned that it's completely solid. I like that background. If it does happen to show through a little bit, as long as it works, you don't want splotches showing through. As long as it's maybe just a hint of color, it would be okay, but definitely not spots. So take a look at it. If it looks unfinished, then put another coat on. I think I probably, oh, I don't know, I maybe 5 or 6 layers by the time each layer's added. But I find if you keep the strokes long and fluid, it takes much less time. Use an appropriate size brush, whether it's an angle or a flat. Make sure that it's a nice, big, healthy, soft bristle brush. You don't want brush strokes. Thin your paint out so that it will move easily. If you're dragging your paint, you just need a little more moisture in it. Now that I have my base coat of bleached sand, I'm going back with warm white to start to brighten up the watering can. Going to stay with that contour of the spout. To pull those colors in there, I'm using that number, I think it's a 10 or a 12 flat. Same thing on the handle. I'll just keep that same fluid stroke. You notice I didn't bring it clear over to the right side. That side's going to be a little bit darker, and that's okay. Same thing on the spout. I'll have the top and the left side a little bit stronger. Just keep in mind where the shadows go. If you brighten it all up, then you just have to go back and darken it down that much more. So let those colors work for you. You can see definite sections of the watering can. That way you know exactly where the shadows need to be put in. This is Snow White, which is really bright. I am pulling that in with I think this is a 1/2 inch wash. You can use a number 12 flat. Just bringing that in. It looks a lot brighter. When it dries, it won't be quite that bright. But I am looking for highlight color. And as long as the strokes are nice and smooth, that's what you want. I don't have any choppy, short, unblended strokes. I can see where my highlight areas are, and I can see where my dark shadows go. Always keep this in mind when you're laying the paint on. Again, make sure that you have enough moisture in your brush. A little bit of paint goes a long way. You just want to make sure it moves easily, especially adding the shadows in. I'm using charcoal gray, and remember we're doing a white watering can, so the charcoal gray needs to be very subtle, very, very thin. If the paint is too heavy, not enough moisture, it becomes dark instead of the bright white, which is what we're looking for. Just enhancing around that spout to help set it off darker toward the bottom and to the right of that spout. Just beginning. And I do add layers of shading. So this is not the shaded finished look. This is just that first application to help divide those highlights and create that contour of roundness. And you can see how much moisture I had. I used the entire float across the bottom to shade up the right side as well. I know that area in there is going to be dark. I kind of wanted a turn on that handle. So I'm making that little area under there just a little bit darker. Right, my light source is on the top left, so the bottom or the right side and the underneath areas will be just a little bit darker. More can always be added, so don't overdo it. And I like to add my highlights and my shadows, my shading at the same time. And by what I mean on that, I'll add a little bit of shading and then I'll go back and add a little more highlights. They have to balance each other out. You need the same value of darkness and brightness for it to look good. If you have really strong highlights and very few shadows, it's off balance. using a 1/2 inch angle to strengthen those shadow areas. If you have trouble with floating smoothly, just use a mop, and I used a 3/4 inch mop to soften that float. Just helps blend it out. Such a light float of color. But I'm using the 1/2 inch angle, which is a very big brush, so it's easy to cover quickly. And then I use my mop to soften it down. Very easy to bring those colors in. Check those edges to make sure I had a little bit of white showing. Going back and adding some Snow White highlights on that under handle. I'm going to make that a little darker underneath. And I do bounce back and forth between the highlights and the shading until I'm happy with it. It's so much easier to go back and add more. Your finger's a great blending tool. And it cleans up easily. You'll never misplace it, so keep that in mind. See how I can really strengthen those shaded areas. I thought maybe the curve needed to go up, and then I decided, nope, it needs to go down. And I can move it that easily. Always looking for the balance. The highlights, make sure the sides are straight. Want to add a couple decorative ridges across the watering can, one across the top and one across the bottom. I'm using my number 2 Radical Round and soft black. Just put a light coat on, and then I can go back and strengthen that. And this is, I want this to be a dark trim piece. Contrast, that's always what is needed to really make things pop. And they need to be pretty much the same width. Dragging a little bit of Snow White highlights across that ridge piece. Be careful it doesn't blend into the watering can. You need to make sure that highlight is on the black. So that's what it looks like. Adding a little bit of charcoal gray shading underneath each ridge. Thinking that looks pretty good. This is a enamel watering can, and they always get those little chips and rusty spots in it. I am using charcoal gray to add this little bit of wear onto the watering can. Make sure they're not directly one above the other or spaced evenly. They need to be very random in not only size but also in placement. I'm picking up just a little bit of soft black and deepening the centers of the whitest part on those little chips. Anywhere that it would show wear, I added some in the corners, across the bottom, here and there on the watering can. Don't overdo it. You don't want it to look like it's leaking, just enough to look like it's been around and well used over the years. And that's just to shadow that handle where it connects just a little bit stronger. Mostly just charcoal gray, but just a touch of soft black to bring a little more depth into the deepest part of the chips. These are not holes, they're just chips in the enamel. Picked up a little bit of raw sienna. I thought since the enamel's chipped, it might have a little bit of rust around the edges. And again, this is just a hint of color. I don't want it to be brown. I just want it to look like it just has that start of age to it. Going back to add a little more strength to those shadows. And I'm always amazed at what a big difference a little bit of paint can make. I love to go back and add little touches because if you do it all at one time, you don't often see. Picking up some Snow White on my palette knife. Check your palette knife before you do it. I had some charcoal gray on there, and you can see I put some of that on the front of the watering can unintentionally. So make sure the palette knife is clean. And I just have, again, just a hint of paint on my palette knife so that I can bring in some strong glossy reflections. There you can see a little bit easier on the bleach sand areas, that just little bits, not a lot. See how nice that looks. If there's too much, you can try to spread it out. If it's too strong, just wipe it back a little bit. It's just such a hint of paint on the palette knife that it's really easy to build it as opposed to if you put too much on. A little bit of charcoal gray, look what that does. I just love the way a palette knife brings that texture so easily, and to me it's very impressive. Don't overdo, just a little bit will make a big difference. A little bit on the handle, a little bit on the underside of the spout, touch across the bottom, and I just went back on the chisel edge of my palette knife to add some stronger, just really strong Snow White highlights. Now I've picked up my Epic script liner, bringing in sharpness and detail, and that's really important to make sure that it doesn't look like it was painted hastily, that you had intention. Wow, what a difference that makes. And look how well that goes with the doily. Now to make that watering can look like it's behind the doily, I'm just floating a little bit of warm white across the top and then make it a little bit uneven. I've transferred the shapes of the daisies. I've loaded my number 5 radical round with bleach sand, and I'm basically just laying in the first layer of petals. And this is mostly for placement. I have a lot of foliage to add in the background, but it's so much easier visually to see what's going on when the bones of the flowers are in place. And this is just a real simple petal that's maybe 2 strokes or 1 stroke. Daisy petals are not always perfectly round and even on the tips, so allow it to be just a little bit, have a little bit of personality, I think is a good term for that. That easy. You don't need to fuss about the petals. Let the brush do all the work. And that's what's so nice about using the correct brush. And this radical round I created, it is just absolutely wonderful to work with. I'm using the same brush now, and lush green, just doing the same thing we did with the flowers. I'm just basing in the placement of the leaves, and the daisy leaves are kind of ragged, so they're not real smooth on the edges. They have kind of a ruffled edge. So they're fun to paint because they're can be so different. Using plantation pine now to bring in a little bit of shadows or dark depth to that. And you can see why I said this was the first layer on the daisy petals. I'm trying not to be messy, but if I do get some of the green on the daisy petals, I'm okay with that because I can go back. And when I work on my daisies, that will be addressed. Filling in those void areas in between the daisies. They'll have some kind of foliage back there. That little slip slap of lush green in the beginning was just like the softening the background. This is Sprout. It's a really strong yellow green. Looks absolutely beautiful on the lush green. Brings in a really bright touch of highlight. Using a 1/4 inch awesome angle. And my angles are awesome because they're a little bit longer than a traditional angle. And that just gives you so much more stroke power. Just doing the leaves the same way that I do everything else is so much easier if you work at all of them instead of doing one leaf completely and then another one. Double loading the number 8 flat with lush green and plantation pine to drop in some filler leaves just to even out the arrangement so that it's nice and full. Bring some down the front. Make sure that they're big enough. Those were really tiny and you lose the balance if they're too little. And I probably went back and made some bigger. Yeah, I did. It just, once you get them in, you can see if it's working or if it's not working. The marguerite or the sprout looks so pretty on the daisy leaves that I want to be sure to add some on the other leaves as well. Just brings that brightness and sunshine. Loading my Epic script liner with plantation pine to pull in the center stems and connect the filler leaves. Picked up a little bit of laurel and it adds a brightness on those center leaves. Helps define that veining. You don't have to spend a lot of time on the leaves, but if you put a little bit of time in the details, that's where everyone notices. Bringing in warm white to highlight these daisy petals. Think about where the light will splash the heaviest. The daisy petals are the same as the leaves. It's so much easier to do all of them instead of trying to paint one daisy at a time. It creates more continuity. You can actually see how it's balancing out, and it makes it much easier to focus on where the highlights need to be strengthened, where the shadows need to be placed, and pulls it all together. If you work on just one and completely finish it and then work on another one, sometimes they don't always have the same attitude. Pulling the highlights in, I'm not blending them super well, just creating that bright areas. I am adding just a little bit of a drop shadow. I have thinned down charcoal gray and applying it with my number 5 radical round, trying to create a little more separation in the foliage and around the daisies. So I switched over to the 1/2 inch angle to create soft shadows. Anywhere it overlaps, hangs down, the petals, anywhere that it needs separation. This is such a fine, thin, transparent wash of soft gray or charcoal gray. Think of it as a shadow. It's transparent, very, very thin. More can always be added very easily. It's so much easier to add more than it is to try to figure out how to remove some of it. Bringing a little bit of the thicket, no, the laurel, in the center of the daisy, just to bring a hint of blue in the daisies. Just helps to give it a little more color, a little more life. And it, again, it's just a hint of color. Too much is going to make it look like the background is showing through. So you just want a hint of that color. It just really adds a nice, soft shade of color to the flowers. Not a lot, just enough to soften it. Taking a look to see where things need to be touched up. I'm just going to brighten that top edge of the doily. Made it a little uneven so it looks ruffled or not completely flat. It just little touches that add a lot of interest. Check out the shading a little bit here and there. It's always good to analyze. Now that I have my highlights blocked in, I'm going back with Snow White. The petals were bleach tanned and then warm white was added, and now this is the bright white. So it's just going to pull in those sharper, stronger highlights. And this is still basically a block of color. It's not softly floated. I want to really pull in the brightness on the petals. With the Snow White, you can start to really see where the highlights or the light splashing on the petals. And it doesn't have to be symmetrical on each flower petal. It can be wherever you put the highlights, that's where the petal is going to be raised. Just adds a little more variety when it's not the same on everything. Add a little bit on the stems, but not much. I didn't want it to be too white, but see how dark that was in there, and that little bit of brightness on that base of the stem just really starts to pull that out of the background. Picked up a little bit of raw sienna on my number 5 radical round to loosely drop in the centers of the daisies. They're all different angles, directional, so that the center doesn't have to be perfectly round. It is on the center one, but the one at the top is a little more oval than round. And it's important to keep those angles on that center so that they look like they're facing correctly. Picked up a little bit of charcoal gray just to enhance the shading between the flower petals to make it a little bit more defined and separated around the base of the centers. You'll notice I did paint the centers, but I didn't like the way those look, so we'll readdress that here in a minute. I am pulling a little bit around the base of the center as well, and kind of up and down into the flower petals themselves. It makes it look like veining, which is a really nice effect. So you float it across and then pull it up and down. I call it my wiggle float. Just a real easy way to drop those shadows in there and pull those, where the shading and the highlighting are a little bit loose. That just pulls that together very nicely. I'll do the same on every single flower petal. And then it's not heavy. I can always go back and add more. I like that option of being able to add more. Just touching up the tips where maybe it's a little bit thin. White does dry. A little bit transparent, translucent. So there will always be those areas where it might need a little more strength on the tips, especially where it overlaps a stronger color. Again, they're not blended. I'm just dropping heavy color on there. And it works really well because it does look like a strong splash of sunlight. Reshape the petals if they're needed. It's not finished until you're happy with it. That's one thing I love about acrylic paint. It's very forgiving, very workable. Everything was added loosely, but this is a time when it's easy to go back with a little more intentional detail. And I did let some of the flower tips on the petals be a little bit ragged. I think that adds a little more personality instead of having them perfectly round and smooth. Whatever you do, be consistent. If you want them to be smooth, make sure they all stay smooth. Went back with moon yellow to redefine the center of the flowers. They're kind of flat on top. They do have a little bit of a bowl, but I wanted to go in and get that basic shape in there. And I'm just painting the sides with a wash of moon yellow. Let this dry really well. You definitely don't want to add paint over wet paint unless you want it blended. Putting a second coat on there just to make sure it's nice and opaque. I did have that other color underneath, and I wanted to start out with a nice base to work with. Picked up a little bit of raw sienna, my 1/4 inch awesome angle, to shade around those side areas. So it still looks like it's raised. Kept it fairly flat on the top. Just want to get that shading in there nicely. This raw sienna looks so pretty over that moon yellow. I do use a lot of moisture in my brush. If it's not floating or moving well, add more water to your brush to be able to move that paint very easily. Picked up some bleach sand to highlight that top and left side. Made sure it was dry first. Just kind of tapped it in. It's not a smooth center, so a little bit of texture is good. I do jump around a lot when I paint. It just makes it easier. I know I will forget later on, and I do have some tracing lines in there that still need to be removed. I have charcoal gray on the toe of my 1/4 inch angle, just touching up a couple places to help anywhere that it needs more contrast or definition. It's super easy to go in and just add that one little touch. And it's such a light wash of color. It doesn't look like it would make a big difference. But we'll go back to my favorite saying, a little bit of paint makes a big difference. I'm tapping in bleach or warm white right now just to give the look of that kind of a bowl in the center, a little bit of raw sienna. I didn't want it quite as intensely defined as I had it the first time around. I just wanted a little bit softer. Just that look of not being even. That is enough. And because I use a lot of water, I do dry often. Wanted to deepen around the base of the center, and I'm using charcoal gray for this. Just be really careful. I have it on the very toe of my brush. Just wanted to darken that area so it blends well into the petals. I don't want a real sharp line there where it begins and ends. Adding a little more on that bowl area just to define that a little bit stronger. It's amazing what a little bit of paint will do. It changes the whole concept of the way that it appears. And pulling that charcoal gray out just a little bit. And I can tell in some of those areas, it just needs that extra bit of darkness in there to make everything look very well connected. And I do spin my project. It's much easier for me to spin the surface than it is to try to twist my hand around. It's very awkward. That was dark, but I have so much water on my brush, it's easy to move around the paint. So if I have it too dark, I can just use it to scooch it around all around the center. And then I won't have to reload. You can see how much more pronounced that center has become with that little bit of darkness around the base of that. Just a touch more. It's so much easier to add a little bit at a time and build that up. And not only is it a safer approach, but also when you build the colors one on top of the other, the final results are much more cohesive. A few little dip dots of Snow White just to highlight that center and bring a little bit of sparkle in there. I didn't go completely around. I tried to pick areas where I felt like the light was the strongest and then just pull some dip dots on that. I decided that I needed to fill that area. I had only planned on doing 5 daisies, but that area on the top left was a little bit empty. And I wanted to add a bud in there. I thought that might balance it out. I'm using a charcoal pencil. This is a white one from Generals. Absolutely love working with these. They don't leave any lines that have to be erased. It's very easy to move them around with just an eraser. So I can sketch in what I want, and then it's very easy to paint over it. I don't have to worry about trying to remove those lines. Picked up a little bit of lush green on the number 5 radical round and just going to base in the bottom, I guess it's the husk of the bud, and get that shape in there. This is such an easy way to paint a bud. Very non-fussy. And I do dry it between layers of paint. So if it looks like I'm putting wet on wet, each layer has been dried. Add a little bit more lush green to add a little more opaqueness to that. And now I'm going to pick up some bleached sand on my number 2 radical round, pull in the bones of the flower petals, and I start at the top and follow the contour of the bud. Just stroke it in, let it be streaky. Going back now with warm white and my Epic script liner, being a little more defined about the petals, but I still want to keep that separation in there. Picked up some sprout to add a little bit of highlight on that top edge and pull down that stem. Put a little bit of plantation pine at the base of the petals. That just helps to look like new growth. Back with Snow White to finish that off and really add that pop of highlight. And it's a little bit stronger on the top, middle, and left. Deepen that base up with plantation pine. Doesn't that look great? How easy is this? Going to highlight that top edge. I picked up a little bit of laurel on my Epic script liner. This is one of my favorite parts, is to pull in that charcoal gray and scoot along that top edge and use the clean part of the brush to encourage it up between the petals of that bud. Look how wonderful that looks. Need to add some more brightness using the sprout, and I just use the toe of my 1/4 inch angle to just really bring more brightness in there. And this is a great way to define the shapes on those leaves. I wanted the daisy leaves to stand out just a little bit more than the filler leaves. That way they don't all look the same. But anywhere that you need more contrast, this is my favorite part. This is the fine tuning. This is where you can look and see if you need more highlights, more shading, pull some areas apart, just bring in soft detail. And remember, as this dries, it's not going to be quite as intense as it looks when it's freshly painted. But I'm using the toe of my 1/4 inch angle to basically as a liner, just to add that little bit of color in there. Don't let it get too strong, and I had to wipe some of it back because I got a little bit carried away. That's what makes it nice about building it up all over. I did add the texture with the charcoal gray and the palette knife on the bottom in the beginning. I wasn't sure if I needed it, but now that I finished the top, it needs that to pull it together. And just adding a little more brightness on that top edge of the doily. I want that to be very defined. Going back, this is the fun part where you can really see where you need to break up those dark areas. I did let this dry thoroughly, removed all tracing lines, and then sealed it with ultra matte varnish. You can use whatever varnish of choice you prefer. Everything I used is listed in the links below. I love how this turned out. I hope you learned some new tips, tricks, and techniques. It is so much fun to paint. I hope you give it a try. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. I would love to hear from you. Be sure to check out my other videos. If you like what you see, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. That way you won't miss out on upcoming videos. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together.